All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we are unpacking some truly fascinating stuff, the highly detailed mechanics of spirit communication, specifically drawing from Chapter 3 of our source text. We aren't just talking about generic ghost stories here. The author actually lays out a highly structured, almost scientific framework for exactly how the unseen world interacts with ours. We're going to break down these concepts step by step so we can really understand this complex spiritual architecture.
So, how do spirits actually communicate with our physical world? That right there is the central mystery we are exploring today. And we're framing this not just as some abstract philosophical question, but as a practical, technical, and historical problem that the source material literally attempts to solve. The text argues that bridging the gap between dimensions requires incredibly specific conditions, a deep understanding of human consciousness, and, surprisingly, a whole lot of historical groundwork.
To get a grip on all this, here is our roadmap for the explainer. 1. The 150-year spiritual plan. 2. The mechanics of spirit communication. 3. The iron armor of flesh. And 4. The two wheels of religion.
Kicking things off with Section 1, the 150-year spiritual plan, and how it aimed to prove the unseen. Okay, so looking right at Chapter 3 of the source text, it frames the dawn of modern spiritualism not as a bunch of random spooky occurrences, but as a highly deliberate strategy. It outlines what it calls a 150-year plan, and the ultimate goal here, to basically force humanity to acknowledge that the unseen world actually exists. According to the author, the spiritual realm realized they needed a systematic, overwhelming approach to finally break through modern materialism.
And the timeline of how this plan supposedly unfolded is pretty wild. It kicks off way back in 1848 in New York with the Fox sisters and their famous rapping poltergeist phenomena. Think loud physical knocks that were just impossible to ignore. But the text notes that this physical phase was really just phase 1. Then we move into the scientific era in the late 19th century, where you have highly respected scientists like Sir William Crookes actually studying materialized spiritual energy, ectoplasm, in a lab setting. From there, in the early 20th century, the movement gained serious intellectual backing from massive literary figures like Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. The source argues this was a highly coordinated effort across decades to drop undeniable, multi-layered proof of life after death right into our laps.
Moving right along to Section 2, the mechanics of spirit communication, or as I like to think of it, tuning the dial.
If the spiritual world is actively trying to communicate, how does the tech actually work? Well, the text boils it all down to the law of same wavelengths. It uses this amazing modern metaphor. It says the human mind acts just like an electromagnet, or a TV and FM radio dial. You simply cannot receive a broadcast if you aren't tuned to the exact right frequency. A person's inner thoughts and spiritual state emit a very specific wavelength, and they will naturally attract and connect with spirits vibrating at that precise, identical frequency. It's totally systemic. If the channel doesn't match perfectly, the audio simply won't come through.
Now, this brings up a super interesting answer to a question skeptics always ask. The author explains why high-level, advanced spirits often hide their identities, using pseudonyms or speaking totally anonymously. Why do that? Because attempting to definitively prove who you were 2,000 or 3,000 years ago is basically an impossible headache in our physical world. It just leads to endless, completely unproductive background checks by skeptics. By remaining anonymous, these higher entities essentially force the receiver, and humanity as a whole, to focus entirely on the actual value and truth of the message itself, rather than getting totally sidetracked by the messenger's historical identity.
Which brings us to Section 3, the iron armor of flesh, and the heavy burden of the physical body. Because here's the thing, even if those wavelengths match perfectly, there is still a massive physical barrier in the way: us. There's this incredibly striking quote in the text that vividly captures how a high spirit actually views the human body. From a higher dimension, trying to enter or interact with our physical form is just incredibly burdensome. It's described as being weighed down by a heavy iron armor. The text likens the experience to a spirit trying to operate inside one of those dense, restrictive, vintage deep sea diver suits, or like a crab just heavily trudging along the dark ocean floor. The vibrational difference is just way too vast for a simple, direct connection.
So, because of this heavy physical armor, direct communication from the very highest realms is super rare. Instead, it requires a step-down mechanism. First, the high spirit formulates the message, but they don't deliver it directly to the human. They use a mediator. An intermediary, or usually a person's guardian spirit, someone just a bit closer to the physical realm's lower dimensions, acts as a translator. They catch that high-frequency message, safely step down the spiritual voltage so it's comprehensible, and then they gently relay that transmission to the human medium.
All right, on to our final section, Part 4, the two wheels of religion, and how we actually maintain this connection. So practically speaking, how do we keep this super fragile connection alive? The text uses a really relatable metaphor here. Imagine you have a direct phone line to the spiritual realms. The problem is our daily worldly distractions. The constant barrage of phones ringing, the endless flood of emails, and yes, apparently even faxes, all of this creates massive static on the line. And that interference drags the mind's wavelength down, which naturally invites unwanted interference from lower, more worldly spirits. To actually cut through that static, the text insists we have to balance two opposing practices, which act as the dual wheels driving religious life. On one side, we have okamori, which translates to spiritual recharging through deep seclusion and meditation. This is the act of silencing the static and generating those calm, receptive alpha waves. But on the flip side, we have missionary work, or worldly action. This is the active transmission of the spiritual light you've received out into society. You cannot just soak it all up. You have to actively engage and spread the message.
But, and this is a huge warning in the text, leaning too far in either direction is incredibly dangerous. If you do too much okomori, you risk extreme isolation. You basically become a hermit who achieves personal peace but helps absolutely no one else. Conversely, if you focus entirely on worldly action and spreading the word without ever stopping to meditate and recharge, your spiritual work just degrades into a corporate business. Your spiritual battery goes completely dead. Keeping a true, sustainable, high-level connection absolutely demands the discipline of both retreating to recharge and stepping forward to act.
As we wrap up this explainer, I really want to leave you with a provocative thought straight from the source material. We've talked about all these complex mechanics of the unseen, but the core requirement here is intensely personal. The text challenges us to look at our own daily lives. In our hyper-connected modern world, buzzing with constant static and heavy physical demands, how do you balance recharging your inner energy with taking action in the modern world? It's definitely a profound question to chew on. Thanks so much for exploring this with me.